village on the banks of the Nile with as authentic an environment as possible. The village is surrounded by an extensive papyrus plantation, which not only reproduces the ancient surroundings, but also, along with the hundreds of trees which were planted around the village, provides an effective screen to isolate this glimpse of Egypt's ancient past from sights and sounds of modern life. The Pharaonic village covers an area of 32 acres, where people dressed in the clothes of ancient times perform their daily tasks in agriculture, industry, religious affairs and home life, using replicas of the tools and instruments of the ancient Egyptians. When Dr. Abdusalam Regev took over the village from his father, he expanded it with 10 special museums, covering such varied subjects as mummification, ancient boats, the Coptic and Islamic periods, and the life of President Nasser. Dr. Abdusalam has made the Pharaonic village into an open book on Egyptian history and culture. You are about to take a voyage back in time to the land of the pharaohs 4,000 years ago. Between the trees is a statue of the Roman god Nilos, the personification of the river Nile. Nilos rests his arm on a sphinx, symbol of Egypt's great antiquity, and is attended by crocodiles which were found in the Nile in ancient times. The children surrounding the god represent the new life and fertility brought to the land by the annual flood. First of all, we will enter the Canal of Mythology, where there are statues of some of the principal gods and pharaohs of ancient times. The plant growing in the water here is papyrus, which was used by the ancient Egyptians for making paper. The modern name actually comes from the name of the plant. Papyrus grew abundantly in Egypt in Pharaonic times, especially in the marshes of the Delta. But it gradually disappeared after new methods of manufacturing paper were brought to this country from China in about 1000 AD. The ancient art of making paper from papyrus was lost until about 30 years ago, when Dr. Hassan Regev started this papyrus plantation and rediscovered the art after many years of research. Papyrus was also used for making boats, mats and sandals, and the lower part of the stem was sometimes eaten as a vegetable. The papyrus plant was the symbol of Lower Egypt, the northern part of the country, while the lotus flower was the symbol of Upper Egypt. As well as being prized for its perfume, the lotus symbolized resurrection to the ancient Egyptians because the flower opens when the life-giving sun is out and closes when the sun sets. Osiris, the god of resurrection and lord of eternity, was usually shown as a mummy, his flesh colored green or black. According to the legend of Osiris, he was a king of Egypt who was foully murdered by his brother Seth, who was jealous of Osiris' popularity. Seth tore Osiris' body into 14 pieces, which he scattered throughout Egypt. Isis, Osiris' faithful wife, searched the country for the pieces of her husband's body, and then brought him back to life, after which she conceived her son Horus, who was eventually to avenge his father's murder. Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris, has her son Horus on her knee. Isis was worshipped all over Egypt as a mother goddess who typified the faithful wife and devoted mother. In the early centuries AD, the cult of Isis was taken to Europe by Roman soldiers who had served in Egypt. The most famous temple of Isis can be visited nowadays on the island of Philae at Aswan. Horus, the falcon god, in his earliest form was the god of aerial space, with the sun and moon as his two eyes. Later he was regarded as the son of Isis and Osiris, who avenged his father's death by fighting with his uncle Seth for the throne of Egypt. After many years of conflict, Horus was at last triumphant. Ammon was the god of the ancient city of Thebes, where Luxor stands today. He first came to prominence in the Middle Kingdom around 1900 BC, and during the New Kingdom from 1550 onwards became the king of the gods. Because he was the god of the Theban kings who drove out the Hyksos, the Asiatic rulers who had ruled Egypt for 150 years. The largest ancient temple in the world, the Great Temple of Karnak in Luxor, was dedicated to the god Ammon. These weeping willow trees helped to create the ancient Egyptian atmosphere and screen the village from its modern surroundings. Thutmosis III was one of the greatest generals of ancient times. He succeeded to the throne of Egypt at about 8 years of age, but was supplanted by his stepmother, Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh for the next 22 years. During this time, Thutmosis trained in the priesthood and the army. As pharaoh, he carried out 17 military campaigns in Western Asia and extended the frontiers of the Egyptian Empire to their furthest limits. Standing in the water is a nilometer, a gauge used by the ancient Egyptians to measure the rise of the annual flood, which occurred every summer. This enabled tax assessors to estimate the revenue from the grain harvest the following spring. Even in those days, farmers complained that they did all the work and the taxman got all the profit. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, the disk of the sun, to be the state god of Egypt in a form of monotheism. At the same time, he introduced a dramatic change of art style and built a new capital city in Middle Egypt. Akhenaten's beautiful wife, Queen Nefertiti, was a keen supporter of the cult of the Aten. After Akhenaten's death, the Egyptians returned to the old form of the religion during the reign of his successor, Tutankhamun, who was probably his son. Later pharaohs tried to wipe out all traces of Akhenaten's existence. Ramesses II had one of the longest reigns in ancient Egyptian history, as he was pharaoh for 67 years. In the 5th year of his reign, he fought a great battle against the Hittites from northern Syria. The battle was indecisive, both sides claiming victory, but it is certain that Ramesses' personal courage saved the Egyptians from defeat. 16 years later, the king signed a peace treaty with the Hittite leader Hattusilis II, which was the first recorded peace treaty in world history. The most famous of Ramesses II's monuments is the great temple at Abu Simbel in Nubia, south of Aswan. This magnificent building, with its famous colossal statues of the king, was cut entirely in the rock, along with the nearby temple of Ramesses' favorite queen, Nefertari. The two temples were rescued from the waters of Lake Nasser when the Aswan High Dam was being built in the 1960s. This scene shows the discovery of the child Moses, whose mother had put him in a basket and floated it on the Nile to prevent him from being killed by Pharaoh's soldiers. The child was discovered by a member of Pharaoh's family and was brought up in the royal palace. Eventually, he became a prophet who led his own people, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. The grotesque dwarf god Bes was a great favorite with the Egyptians. He was believed to protect people against snakes and scorpions, and was particularly regarded as a patron of women in childbirth. In general, Bes was the god of pleasure and enjoyment of every kind. Now life in ancient Egypt comes alive with scenes of agriculture and industry. The nobleman and his wife are enjoying the fresh air in their garden pavilion. They are playing a game called senet, a game for 2 players, a form of which is still played in Egypt today. Ploughing is the first operation in preparing the land for cultivation, and here we see the ploughman with his team and the simple wooden plough. After ploughing, the heavy clods of soil are broken up with a hoe, and then furrows are made with the broad-bladed mattock. The sower scatters the seed from a small bag or basket, and sheep follow the sower to press the seed into the tough soil with their feet. Beside the houses in the background are pigeon towers. The Egyptians kept pigeons for food, and they were used for carrying messages, especially for the army. The fields are irrigated by means of the shadoof, which works like a balance, with a bucket at one end of a long pole and a heavy stone as a counterweight. Shadoofs are still sometimes used in the Egyptian countryside. When the grain is harvested, the sheaves are carried to the threshing floor in a net bag hung on a long pole. When a thick layer of grain has been spread on the circular floor, oxen or cows are driven round to break up the ears of grain with their heavy feet. The next process is winnowing, when the grain is tossed up into the air so that the lighter chaff or husk will blow away on the wind. The grain is then taken to be stored in the silos. The scribe makes a careful record of all the grain which is being stored. This was important for taxation purposes, as there was no money in Egypt in Pharaonic times. Honey was used for sweetening by the ancient Egyptians, as sugarcane was not grown in Egypt in those days. Beehives were made of pottery tubes piled up in rows, and in some parts of the country, beehives are still made this way today. The River Nile was the main highway of communication in Pharaonic times, so boat building was an important industry. Small boats were made of bundles of papyrus tied together with ropes. Such boats were used for short journeys and for fishing or hunting trips. Larger boats were made of wood, usually cedar wood imported from Lebanon. Wooden boats were pegged together with dowels and sewn together with ropes, as can be seen in the cross-section on the bank. When the boat was put into the water, the wood expanded and the rope shrank, so the boat became completely watertight. A royal boat of this type can be seen in the museum beside the Great Pyramid of King Cheops at Giza. The palm tree was a valuable resource for the Egyptians. The trunk was used in house building, and the branches provided fronds for making mats and baskets, while furniture and boxes were made from the ribs. The boxes were used for storage and as cages for small animals and birds. The Egyptians today still use the various parts of the palm tree for the same purposes. There were many different kinds of fish in the Nile and its canals which made good food. and fishing was also popular as a sport. One method of fishing can be seen here, where a net is stretched between two boats, and the fisherman hits the water with a stick to frighten the fish into the net. Let's see if he's been lucky today. Next, there are demonstrations of some... industries and crafts, the first of which is brick making. The material used is the Nile mud, which is mixed with water and chopped straw into a thick paste. This paste is put into a wooden mould, and the bricks are then simply left to dry in the sun. As there is little heavy rain in Egypt, these mud bricks can last for centuries. The houses of the ancient Egyptians, even the palaces of the pharaohs, were constructed of sun-dried mud brick. The roof was made of split palm trunks covered with branches. The building was covered with a thick layer of mud, which acted as insulation against heat, wind, and rain. Glass making was introduced into Egypt after the military campaigns of Thutmose III about 1450 BC, when captive glass makers were brought here from Syria. Glass was used for making beads, inlays, amulets and small vessels, which were formed around a core, as glass blowing was not invented until the 1st century BC. In Ptolemaic times, Alexandria became a center of glass craftsmanship, and in the Roman period, fine cameos were produced in the same city. The Egyptians are also famous for mummifying their dead. Mummification is basically dehydration, and to speed up this process, the internal organs of the body were removed and preserved separately. The body was dried out by being covered with natron salt, a form of soda found in the deserts of Egypt. The body was then cleaned and embalmed and wrapped in several layers of linen bandages. Amulets were put between the bandages to protect the mummy from harm. The whole process took 70 days. Pottery making is one of the oldest crafts in Egypt, dating back to about 6000 BC. The clay is kneaded with water and mixed with ground potsherds or chopped straw, which helps the finished pot to dry evenly without cracking. The potter forms the pot with his fingers as he kicks the wheel round with his foot. The handles are added afterwards, and the pot is dried in the sun for a while before being fired. Now for a little Egyptian magic. This scene shows the different stages in decorating a stone wall. First of all, the surface is leveled, then smoothed and polished with a piece of hard stone. Grid lines are marked in red on the prepared surface to ensure accurate enlargements of the original drawings. The artist copies the outline onto the wall, working from the sketch made by the chief artist on a small slab of stone or a piece of papyrus. Then the sculptor carves the design in relief with his mallet and chisel. Finally, the details would be painted in color to make the picture look as realistic as possible. Statues were partially carved in the quarry where the stone for them was cut. First of all, the block of stone is separated from the rock face by hammering wooden wedges into holes cut in the rock. The wedges are soaked with water, and as the wood expands, the block breaks away. After the stone has been smoothed and polished, the profile of the work is outlined on one side, and then the sculptor carves out the figure, rounding it off first on the front and then on the back. Vases were made from various kinds of stone, particularly alabaster, a soft stone which was worked into beautiful designs. After the rough piece of alabaster has been polished smooth, the inside is hollowed out with a drill with a flint or copper bit. The vase is sunk into the ground to prevent cracking during drilling. Alabaster vases were used as lamps and for storing perfumes and precious oils. The tools of the carpenter and joiner were made of copper, wood and bronze. On the left, a man is sawing a log of wood into planks. Other tools used were a hammer, chisel, an adze and a bow drill for boring holes. It was important to the pharaohs that the army was well equipped at all times. Weapons included bows and arrows, swords, battle axes and spears, as well as shields and throw sticks. The horse-drawn war chariot was introduced into Egypt by the Hyksos from Western Asia around 1700 BC. Perfumes were very popular in ancient Egypt and consisted chiefly of fragrant oils and fats. The juice is extracted from sweet-smelling flowers in a bag of heavy canvas, the ends of which are twisted in opposite directions with wooden bars. This scented extract is then mixed with oil or fat as a base. Linen made from the flax plant was used by the Egyptians for clothing and many other purposes. Bundles of flax stalks are pulled through a large wooden comb to remove the tops and leaves. The stalks are soaked in water for a few days to soften them and then beaten with a wooden mallet. They are then pulled through a smaller comb to separate the fibers from the outer woody covering, and the good fibers are picked out and spun into thread on a spindle. The fine linen thread is then woven into cloth on a loom. The earliest looms in Egypt were horizontal, and the upright loom was brought to this country by the Hyksos. Another important industry was papyrus paper making, for which the government had the monopoly. The lowest part of the stem is the best part for paper making. The outer green rind is peeled off and the white pith is sliced into thin strips which are soaked in water. After repeated soaking, the now pliable strips are placed on a piece of cloth in 2 layers, one vertical and one horizontal. The surface of the sheet thus formed is then hammered with a wooden mallet to cause the fibers of the 2 layers to stick together. The sheet is then covered with another piece of cloth and pressed between 2 heavy stones for several days. During that time it also dries out in the hot sun and the piece of paper is ready for use. Good wine was appreciated in Pharaonic times, and this scene shows the method of winemaking. Bunches of ripe grapes are taken to the vat where the grapes are trodden out, and the juice extracted is poured into large pottery jars to ferment. When this process is complete, the jars are sealed with a clay seal, which is stamped with the date and the name of the vineyard where the grapes were grown.
بالك يا باشا.
ഇറക്കി വിടും